Hi, my name is Nicola Jennings. I'm Director of Kolnagi Foundation. Welcome to Kolnagi Foundation Lates, talks with interesting people about new art exhibitions, publications and events in the UK and around the world. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Earnestine Jenkins. Ernestine is a professor of art history and visual culture studies in the Department of Art at the University of Memphis. After writing her PhD dissertation on art and leadership in Ethiopia, Ernestine went on to do a postdoctoral fellowship in comparative Black history at Michigan State University, followed by a year as the curator of the Education Institute of Egyptian Art and Archaeology at the University of Memphis. Since then, she's won a number of awards, spoken at many conferences, not only in the United States, but in Britain and Poland. And she's been involved in several community and media projects, curated several exhibitions, and published numerous articles and books, most recently on Anna Murray Douglas and on race representation and photography in 19th century Memphis. Ernestine is going to talk to us today about this portrait of the 19th century actor Ira Aldridge in the Manchester Art Gallery, about which she wrote in the book Spectacles of Blackness, Representing Blacks in European Art of the Long 19th Century. Tell us a little bit about who Ira Aldridge was.
Ira Aldridge was born about 1807 in New York City, and I think it's really interesting to think about the larger historical context in which he was born. He was born during a time when slavery was beginning to be phased out in the northern states and colonies. His father was a peddler. He was also a preacher. And since they were phasing slavery out of New York City, he was able to attend the African Free School, which was schools that were set up for former slaves. And this enabled him to get an introduction to the classics. And then as a teenager, he started to become interested in the theater. And so he became part of what is considered to be the first Black theater company in the United States, called the African Grove Theater, created by one of the early Black actors, James Hewlett. And so he had this experience in terms of the performed arts, even though his father wanted him to follow in his footsteps and be a preacher. There is still a lot of restrictions for free Blacks in a place like New York City. But still, he was born at a time when there were opportunities in the North, more than there were for Black people who were predominantly slaves, and even a few free Blacks that were born in the South.
Why did he move to the UK?
Well, even though they were having some success with the African Grove Theater, it was always running up against resistance from local whites in New York City. They would attack members of the group. They would destroy property associated with the African Grove Theater. In some ways, it was looked at as competition for some of the local white theaters. So he decided that he would go to Europe, probably under the influence of a British actor named Wallach, that we assume agreed to look after him because that was the person whom he followed to Europe when he left, when he was about 17 years old.
What happened when he came to England?
Well, when he first came, I think it was to Liverpool, and then he went to Glasgow for about a year, and it seems like he was able to get some more training. And then after that year, he makes one performance in London before he's basically run out of the city. The idea to Londoners that you had this person of African descent who was also foreign and from the United States actually coming to London and having the audacity to play Shakespeare, even though Othello is a non-white character. So there's issues of race and how people perceive that, who they think should be playing Shakespeare's characters. So he retreats to the provinces, and that's where he's able to get more experience. He marries a white woman who is older than him. Both of those things, I think, start to give him some stability, inroads into British society. In the provinces, they seem to be more open to this idea of this Black person from the United States starting to play Shakespeare's characters. Hull and Manchester become very important because they are sites of the abolitionist movement. And when you look at the way that they start to present Ira Aldridge, I think that maybe we can argue for a more working class community that seems to be more open to the visual impact of having this Black person play Shakespeare, that maybe they see some connections or links in terms of status and class.
Because really until that time you had actors like the very famous Edmund Kean, who played Othello in a blacked up face or a tawny face. How did Edmund Kean play Othello?
I've looked at some of the images of the actors and the way that they reshaped themselves from a racial perspective to play Othello. But I don't know if it is as much of a blackening up as it is a sort of tawny brown look that may have been influenced in terms of the relationship with the Mediterranean and with North Africa as opposed to Black Africa.
But the critics couldn't make their minds up about Aldridge. Sometimes they said he's not black enough, and then other times they said he's not tawny enough.
So then it becomes an issue of really reading and understanding the racial biases that the critics are coming from. And in the early 19th century, you have a fair number of Black people from Africa in Britain. You also have increasing numbers of Blacks coming from the United States. So you have those different peoples from the African diaspora that are in Britain. And I would argue that they influence the way that the critics are writing about Ira Aldridge. Some of them describe him as being dark or too Black. And then you have others, as you said, who describe him as not being Black enough or being mulatto or having a voice that sounds too American, too Black or too African. It's this uncomfortable position with the other. Those biases prevent them from authentically critiquing his performances. He did get some of that in the provinces, but when he starts to perform in London again, the critics are still at the same position that they were before.
Even though he's been so popular in Manchester, in Hull, he gets top billing.
Yes. Once he goes back to London, those few instances where you do get a good reception, even though they are often few and far between, that's where you start to get the comparisons to the African Roscius, because he was the famous actor in Rome during the 1st century BC, because critics start to see something of distinction in his performances. He's also helping because, like a lot of performers in the 19th century, he begins to actively associate himself with famous performers of the past, like King. He begins to create a myth around his ancestry and identity, claiming that he is a prince from Senegal. And so all of these things help to actually feed into building up his reputation. So that by the 1850s, when he starts to perform in Europe and in Russia, he's a fairly well-respected actor.
Let's go back to Hull, because Hull was the home of William Wilberforce, and he had great success in Hull, am I right?
Yes, Hull and also Manchester. They are complicated in terms of Ira Aldridge's success. They are centers of the abolitionist movement. Manchester is where they end up purchasing the portrait that is done by Northcote even before they build the museum. But what is happening in Britain is comparable to what's going on in the United States as well. You start to have white and Black abolitionists begin to deal with the impact that images can have and the ways in which they can portray people of African descent, either as victims because of the slave trade and because of colonialism, which would be images that can work on their behalf. For instance, Wedgwood images of the kneeling slave who is portrayed as begging or asking for their freedom. But they also want to take the chance to use someone like an Ira Aldridge, who is this first world-renowned, internationally known Black actor, and use those as proof of the humanity and the intellectual and creative possibilities that Black people can have when you view them as part of humanity.
Aldridge himself was very vocal on behalf of the abolitionist movement, wasn't he? He actually talked to his audiences.
Yes. After his performances, he would speak about the issues of slavery. He would often sing spirituals, other songs that he had learned as a child associated with African American culture. Once he started to have success, he would send money back to abolitionist groups to help support them. He helped to free a Black family that had escaped from the South. He was part of the National Black Conventions that started with Frederick Douglass to help work towards the abolition of slavery. So the wind of freedom, African Americans becoming free. He was very much aware of it. And towards the end of his career, he was planning to go back to the country of his birth, planning a 100 performance tour across the United States.
Let's talk about the painting now.
So the painting was done by James Northcote, and he was then already a well-known painter associated with the Romanticist style of painting. We think that maybe Ira Aldridge actually set for the portrait because he was in the area when Aldridge was performing in the provinces, including Manchester and Hull. And I was struck by the youth of it because it did not depict Othello in the age that he is in Shakespeare's play. It's a young Othello. And so to me, it's always been a complicated portrait because it appears to depict both Ira Aldridge and also the character of Othello. I think the Northcote especially captured that caught in between position that Ira Aldridge and that the character Othello must have been in as a foreigner, as an other, as a displaced person coming from Africa, reaching a certain ascendancy, and then having to deal with betrayal. I think that personal betrayal of Othello also becomes that betrayal associated with his race and his position in a foreign country. That is what Shakespeare's creation of the character captured. And it's why we're still so fascinated with the character. That's the beginning of the modern era in the global world. Initially, you had white men playing that character. And so when people were confronted with the real life version, it was such an assault on the senses. And I think the portrait captures all of that history.
He captures him at a point when Othello is still innocent enough and hopeful enough to believe that things could turn out well.
And the later images are often the ones that depict him dealing with finding out that Desdemona was actually not betraying him with another man. And so he's devastated. But this is very different. This is that young Ira Aldridge when he first comes to the country. It was often critiqued as not really representing the character of Othello because it's not dramatic enough. It has no sweeping gestures that tells you that is who actually is being represented except for the title. The title has always been Othello. And initially, the name Ira Aldridge was not part of the title. But that makes it all the more powerful in terms of doing what portraits were supposed to do in the early 19th century, particularly within the Romanticist tradition. People thought portraiture was something that enabled you to get at the inner soul of a person. And in order to do that, Northcote had to reverse some of the ways in which traditional portraiture was painted, particularly when the subject has light skin tone. He could have painted that backdrop very dark, like we see in much of traditional portraiture from that period. But he uses these soft, grayish tones with some pink and white. The costume is brilliantly white, but it is softened up with those gray, pinkish overtones. And the flesh colors are done so beautifully. You don't have that excessively dark, opaque look that some artists were doing in depicting people of African descent. You can see how he replicated the sort of soft, brownish black curls of Ira Aldridge's hair. Another one of the things that makes Northcote's portrait of Ira Aldridge so extraordinary is that he worked against the practice of creating portraits to racial types. And it's important to note the impact that the sciences were starting to have on the arts, the relationship between the two, because artists were being influenced by the practices of science or pseudoscience, let's say more correctly, and the ways in which people thought that the characters of people could be determined based on their facial structure. And there was a hierarchy that was created where Europeans or whites, of course, were at the top and people of African descent were at the bottom. And there were these caricatures that were made based on race that artists were supposed to follow. And when you look at Northcote's portrait, he rejects all of that. He doesn't overemphasize facial features. He doesn't make them ugly. In fact, Ira Aldridge is very beautiful to look at. And so Northcote gave us something entirely different and rejected those stereotypes of racial description that many artists were being encouraged to follow. This is another portrait of Ira Aldridge in the role of Othello by Henry Perronet Briggs. He does give a view of Ira Aldridge that is more typical in terms of the dress and presenting him in the role of Othello than Northcote did. I think it's important to note the style of costume, the way that he has portrayed Ira Aldridge with more confidence. He's an older person, he's a larger person in terms of his physique, so he's more imposing in some ways than the younger, more innocent portrait that was done by Northcote. We are not sure if Briggs actually saw Aldridge and if he painted this from life, but the treatment of the hair, the general features, the skin color is a bit darker. I think it's an important portrait again in terms of the way that he presents Ira Aldridge in character, and with Othello leaning in to the portrait and towards the viewer. Again, I think it gives the portrait a sense of confidence in the role that the younger Ira Aldridge, as painted by Northcote, does not have.
Let's talk a little bit about some other exotic figures for people at the time and how they were represented. This portrait of Omai, there are similarities, aren't there, in terms of the costume and the way that they're portrayed. And there's this idea of the noble savage, isn't there?
That approach to romanticized painting where the subject is ennobled by the stature. This is the influence of Reynolds. For instance, with the image of Omai, it's a full-length portrait. His head is almost in the clouds. The landscape is in the lower part of the background. The style of the clothing is borrowed from classical togas. So it all gives the romantic, idealized image of the noble savage. And it may be that there's a bit of that noble savage in Northcote's approach to Ira Aldridge, but I would argue that Northcote's approach is more of how he is becoming a symbol of freedom.
This is such an extraordinary painting, painted after the Aldridge.
This is the painting of Joseph Cinque by Nathaniel Jocelyn, painted in 1840. I think that there is a close relationship between these images by well-known artists of the first half of the 19th century for the reasons that I was talking about before, that these are both images of young Black men who became prominent because of historical events. Cinque becomes important because of his association with the Amistad, the slave ship that was captured by the Spanish, and then there was the revolt on board, and it ends up in Massachusetts where there is this trial. Cinque becomes one of the leaders, and when Nathaniel Jocelyn paints him, he paints him also in relationship to the history of the abolitionist movement. And again, it becomes an image that they use to prove, if we have to use that word, the humanity of Black people. And you can see this, Jocelyn is doing the same thing with the figure of Cinque. He dresses him wearing a toga and holding a traditional implement associated with the warrior. Again, there is that treatment of the sky and the positioning of Cinque's head above the horizon that is typical in terms of ennobling a figure in 18th and 19th century European romanticized painting.
Ernestine, thank you so much. It's a wonderful painting, and I'm so pleased that you wrote about it because it's really made me think about it very hard.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about the piece.